Thank you for joining me this afternoon. Today we're going to be in Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 to 21. I put a suggested memory verse here, Matthew 6:21. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Okay, well today we're going to start in Matthew 6, verse 19. And it says, Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. Okay, I was looking at that word treasures. Lay not up for yourselves treasures. Treasures are defined as wealth or something of great value, money, maybe jewels or gems. It's a collection of precious things that are precious to that individual. It's stored riches. So a treasure to you may not be a treasure to me. It's kind of a subjective thing. In Luke 12:15, Jesus said unto them, he said unto them, Take heed and beware of covetousness, for a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. There's more to treasure than the things that we have. The best treasure is what we store in heaven. We go back to verse 19. It says, Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth, I was looking at that word moth, just some fun facts about moths. There are 2,500 known species of moths. Only 2 of these species that we know of eat wool, fur, and feathers. Some moths eat wood, but moths do destroy things, they do corrupt things. Moths are an indicator that the ecosystem is doing well, so moths are important. If we don't see moths, there's a problem with the ecosystem. The death's head hawk moth looks like a bumblebee. This allows them to enter the beehive and steal honey. Some moths can live underwater. They can stay underwater for weeks without coming up for air. They are the only known insect that can live underwater. That's some facts about moths. And then we get to the next word, and it says rust. Rust, if you see rust, obviously that's a sign of neglect. Rust weakens the metal. It's a form of corrosion. It's harmful to your health. If left untreated, rust will spread. Okay, so we're looking at this. It says, Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. These things perish. They rust. They get ruined, they get lost or stolen. They're not secure. I've had things that I really liked at the time. Now I don't even know where they are. When I was little, one year my mom got me this stuffed monkey for Christmas. And I called it Monkey, but I loved that monkey. To me, it was my treasure. But today, I don't even know where it is. Those things, they're temporary. They're temporal. And then we go to verse 20. And verse 20 says, excuse me, But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. And I was looking at that word heaven. Some of the things that the Bible tells us about heaven. Jesus says in 1 Peter 1:4, To an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled, and that fadeth not away, reserved in heaven for you. So things won't decay in heaven. Things don't rust in heaven. Everything we do for the kingdom of God will be remembered and rewarded. We go to Matthew chapter 10, starting in verse 41. It says, "He that receiveth a prophet in the name of a prophet shall receive a prophet's reward. And he that receiveth a righteous man in the name of a righteous man shall receive a righteous man's reward. And whosoever shall give to drink unto one of these little ones a cup of cold water, only in the name of a disciple, verily I say unto you, he shall in no wise lose his reward." This is how we store up treasures in heaven. Like this said, there's no moths in heaven. There's no rust in heaven. There's no thieves in heaven. Our treasures in heaven, they're not going to decay. They're forever. And we go to verse 21. And verse 21 says, "For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." And I was thinking of a parable that Jesus told about a rich man, starting in Luke chapter 12, verse 16. "And he spake a parable unto them, saying, The ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, What shall I do? Because I have no room where to bestow my fruits. And he said, This will I do. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there will I bestow all my fruits and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry." But then what happened? "But God said unto him, Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then whose shall those things be which thou hast provided? So is he that layeth up treasure for himself, and is not rich toward God." Where was his heart? Was it on God, or was it on his possessions? Instead of using his increase to further the will of God, he used it to become wealthy. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. His heart, all he cared about was his possessions. We go to Psalms 62, verse 10. It says, at the end of that verse, it says, "If riches increase, set not your heart upon them." God blesses us so we can bless others. Don't be selfish. We shouldn't be greedy. We go to Philippians 2, verse 3. It says, "Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind, let each other esteem other better than themselves." We should love others more than we love ourselves, according to this verse. Jesus said, "Love your neighbor as yourself." And have you ever seen, this reminds me of the movie, the Amazing Rupert, or The Great Rupert. And what happened was, there was a guy named Joe. He was an actor. He was a performer. And he had a dancing squirrel, which the squirrel's name was Rupert. He was falling on hard times. So he dropped the squirrel off. He dropped Rupert off with other squirrels to live in the trees. And Joe and his wife and his daughter, they rented a downstairs apartment from Frank Dingle and his family. So the Dingles lived upstairs, and Joe and his family lived downstairs. Well, talk a little bit about Frank. Frank Dingle lives with his wife and their son, Pete. Well, Frank recently learned a gold mine he'd invested in years earlier will start paying a return of $1,500 a week. Well, Frank began cashing the checks and hiding the bills in a hole in his bedroom wall because he didn't trust in banks. So he'd get his money and he'd put it in this hole in the wall. Well, okay, now let's go back to Rupert. Rupert is the squirrel. Rupert decides he doesn't want to live with the squirrels. He doesn't want to live in the trees. So he finds where Joe's living. And he goes and he lives in the house, but he lives in a space between the walls of Frank Dingle's bedroom. So Frank Dingle is putting the money in that hole in the wall. Well, that's where the squirrel's at. Well, the squirrel doesn't like the money. It's getting in his way. So every time Frank puts money in that wall, the squirrel kicks it out and it falls through the hole in the floor, which is also the ceiling of Joe's house, because Joe lives right underneath him. Well, Joe's family is poor. They need food, they need clothes, and the rent's due, their bills are due, and they have no money. So Frank's wife, she sits in the rocking chair and she prays, Lord, we need money for food and clothes, and our daughter needs shoes. And immediately that money falls from the ceiling. Well, they think it's the Lord answering their prayers. So they use this money to pay all their bills. Well, the next month, they need money again. All the bills are due again. And Joe asks, well, what did you do last time? And she said, well, last time I sat in this chair and I prayed. And she said like this. And so she sat down in the chair and prayed. And again, that money fell through the ceiling again. So they use this money, to pay their bills. And they also use the money, when their friends are having problems, they start helping their friends so they don't lose their businesses. So Joe is a part owner of every business in town. Well, this creates gossip. Everybody wants to know where they're getting all this money. And so, of course, the IRS shows up and they want to know where they're getting all this money. And, of course, all Joe and his wife know is that they pray and God sends them money. Well, in the course of all this, Rupert, the squirrel, he still lives in that hole in the wall. Well, he finds a cigarette and he hides it in the wall. It starts a fire and it burns the whole house down. And I was thinking about this movie, and if you've never seen it, you need to see it. It's a really good show. I think it's usually on around Christmas. It's called The Great Rupert or The Amazing Rupert. So if you think about these two people, you think about Joe. Joe cared for everyone. He kept many of his friends from losing their businesses. He's very likable, very friendly. And then you think of Frank. Frank only cared about himself, and he lost all of his money. That house burnt down. He lost everything he had because everything he had was in that house. So I have a suggested journal entry for you this month. I want you to look at your bank statements for the last 3 months, and I just want us to ask ourselves, where have we been spending our money the last 3 months? Are we like Joe or are we like Frank? Are we like Joe? Are we helping others? That, it doesn't say that Joe spent all his money and gave it to everybody else, but, he might have saved it. I don't know, but he did use it to help other people. Or are we like Frank, who only cared about himself? You think about it. Who lived in that house? Who lived in that house when it burnt down? Joe and Frank both lived in that house. Both their families lived in that house. But Frank lost everything because everything he had was in that hole in the wall. And so the house caught on fire, which, in all honesty, his money wasn't in the wall because really that's where Joe got his money, but Frank didn't know that. But Joe didn't lose everything because Joe used it to help other people. Thank you for joining me today. And if you enjoyed this, remember to like and subscribe and share this.